Bomb Rush Cyberfunk was my most anticipated title of 2023. I'm a huge fan of the Tony Hawk series / extreme sports genre in general, longing for the days when I was 10 with SSX chomping at my heels for another run down a mountain, and in ignorance that nobody was paying the taxes. Now I'm 26, and while the taxes remain the same, the extreme sports genre is basically a corpse in Tampa's water, only floating to the surface because nostalgia weighs less than acknowledging 4 was a bit mid. So when I saw the boy that was BRC coming to save the genre, and subsequently this drawn out analogy, to say I was excited would have been an understatement. To top it off, it was taking obvious inspiration from Jet Set Radio, something that's equal parts Good Omen and Red Flag, and was developed by those guys who made that one game everyone loves but hardly anyone plays. Count me the fuck in. Finally having got my hands on it and letting the game sit in my craw for a couple of weeks, I can thankfully say I'm pretty happy with what I played. Though much like the Tony Hawk series that I'm so fond of, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a mixed bag. Or for the TikTok generation, a tier list that doesn't stop at A, have this vertical slice Family Guy clip, you're gonna need it. On the one hand, I was grinning ear to ear throughout the 8-hour campaign, enamored with all its flair and fresh ideas it brought to the table. But on the other, I can't help but acknowledge it's really missing something, with the game's flair occasionally acting as a set of high beams that blinds you from the fact that it's a little mechanically malnourished. It subsequently formed two sides of an opinion coin that thankfully landed positive side up for me, but the flip it generated left me with a lot to talk about. Not so much because things were grinding my gears, but because it felt like some of the gears were missing. Get some popcorn, put your flip phones away, and if you liked the video enough, feel free to drop some coins in the Patreon cabinet. Also, if you couldn't figure it out from the video length, spoilers ahead. Seriously, spoilers start right now. Story-wise, they're not that important, but if you're drawn to the game's aesthetics, maybe you don't want an area or two spoiled. In New Amsterdam, there's only two things that matter: graffiti and respect. So get on your board, blades, and bikes, tag some walls, and start some scraps with the locals so you can expand your influence and go the fabled All City. That's the goal of the game, or at least it is after you break out of jail and subsequently die. Going All City is the goal of every click in the burbs, but for you specifically, it's what should put your body back together after it was confiscated by what is assumed to be DJ Cyber. Story's kinda goofy ass as you can see, not without having any fun inside of it, but primarily acting as a container for simple tasks and providing a pace to your vandalism. Once the opening sequence is finished and you finally touch wheels to the pavement, you're basically playing the game you're going to finish. Tricks, tags, and traversal. Hope you like it. There's no RPG here standing between you and the rest of the gameplay, and so begins the cycle of getting into a new area and tagging some walls so you can prove yourself to a rival, so you can unlock a new area, and now the elephant in the room is getting stompy and loud. Jet Set Radio's influence goes further than aesthetic. It leaks into the pores of quite a lot of this game, including the title. It's kind of a fun bastardization. If you're like me, that might induce some panic in you, because I don't like Jet Set Radio. Quite frankly, I think people claiming it's good is either a worldwide gaslight or a car hotboxed with copium. Everyone in it's so high on cell shading they haven't realized the child lock isn't letting them out of the car. The child lock in this example is backface culling, which, dickhead, we've had this for years! So it might surprise you that even as a pro skaterhead, I think in Bomb Rush Cyberfunk this cycle of tagging walls to tag more walls works pretty well. The two large evolutions being a change to larger level structure that makes it range from passable to good, and additional complexities in the movement which makes traversal comfortably enjoyable to pretty neat. In Jet Set Radio, the conventional design of the time put levels as these laborious labyrinths of one task, draining you of any joy by the time the level had finished. That's number 540, go around and grab enough cans to tag the whole wide open space. That's also Love Trap, and again, it's Graffiti High, all of which I played back to back and was tired of before I even finished the first one. The density of the repetition makes everything a chore, often directionless in the concept of a challenge or a connective line, so what should be a fun rapid-fire checking off of objectives becomes a trawl towards whatever spot you missed that ends the level. BRC instead puts you in more open spaces. They are segmented in a way, but there's no distinctive mission structure, and while that might sound like it opens the door to make for a painfully long crawl to every completed level, it's the exact opposite. Tagging gains you respect, and respect grants you access to micro-challenges, typically speaking something as simple as follow this line, but you never have to tag everything possible to gain the respect to do said micro missions. This puts a lot more of the game's pacing in your hands, letting you engage with the area from the concept of exploration without the pressure of having to overturn every fucking dead end for a spot. If you like the idea of Jet Set Radio's more completionist structure, you can try and tag everything before moving on, and for everyone else who's normal, you can keep going for as long as you like until the hunt for spots starts to get a bit too obscure. By that point, you'll probably have unlocked all of the challenges and can give yourself a pace breaker that creates a comfortable jog through the game's content. It's not exactly relaxing, but it is a cozy vibe. Structurally, this makes the entire game less bloated than its inspiration, but what turns this from passable to genuinely fun is how tricking and movement contributes to the tagging process. Movement by itself is snappy but slow. You never feel particularly unwieldy, but it doesn't feel good to move around if you're playing it like a conventional platformer. Tricking, however, has a collection of smaller mechanics inside of it that lets you turn snappy and sluggish into zippy and another contrasting positive. Popping a manual from great height gives you a little speed boost. Leaning into corners bumps your momentum up. Grinding lets you clamp to a decent speed that helps you get back into a rhythm if you start to slow down. These little features go a long way in giving your movement a comfortable ebb and flow that encourages you to find lines around the map and contributes to a sense of control. On top of that, graffiti spots are often placed in these lines. So unlike Jet Set Radio, where it feels like you're constantly stopping and starting because the level is literally making you stop and start, you're cruising along the walls and rails, hunting down the next place to be that's fun to traverse, which normally just so happens to lead to your next tag. Combine that with a scoring system that serves the function of not only being a self-generated high score to chase, but also contributing to a boost meter that can be activated at any time, and oh my god, it's Airblade 2. The score being tied to boost encourages you to not only trick at all times, but try to constantly keep your combo high since a higher score generates more boost per trick. These are all small additions to movement, but it contributes to spaces that, when you're really schmoovin', are a joy to climb and explore, particularly on your initial playthrough. All this stuff creates a natural flow that kept me glued throughout the roughly 8-hour campaign. Movement feeds into tricks, which feeds back into itself and tagging, that feeding into unlocking more of whatever cell-shaded material is making up the next urban jungle. It made me eager to keep playing, or at least it was why I was so excited for the cutscene to end. For as much as I was more focused on the game's systems and remembering the names of all of the songs so I could put them in my White Woman playlist later, BRC is pretty thick with its story. I wouldn't exactly call it involved. Despite aspects of it revolving around police corruption, it's not going to try and dissect the impact of France's proposed pension reform and how it affected Rodney Mullen's Dark Slide. It just comes up a lot more than you might have expected, and for some, I'd imagine a lot more than they would like. Between Tyrese, Red, and Belle, who are determined, hard-headed groupies, you've got supporting caricatures that put the story in an early 2000s cartoon world. Think less insufferably self-serious Ben 10 and more the rompy roller coaster of Shaolin Showdown. Between .exe's boxy nerdcore aesthetic, the star sign horoscope worship of Eclipse, and the ragtag people are Lego perspective from the Franks, you've got a group of fairly fun, distinct cliques that are all pushed against by the cold boringness of the police force. It gives off an air that fun is not allowed in this world, which is admittedly a cliche villain, but not exactly a problem. All I'd be looking for is enough of a motive to push more evolved characters' personalities and story beats to pace out the gameplay, and for the most part it succeeds in doing so. Outside of using the story as a way to block off levels and have them slowly expand, it uses story-based dream sequences to create these linear mini-levels to shake up the formula and color palette. They might not be much, but in a game that's normally wide open with its level design, some more cornered off railways are appreciated. They almost feel like miniature Ollie worlds. They're not difficult or mind-blowing, but comfortable visual spectacles that have a nice rhythm to them. It lets the mechanics be more traversal oriented, and softly recontextualizes the purpose of the mechanics set, which is a gold star for my liking. It's a shame there's so few of them, but at the same time, to make more of them would mean either making the story more prominent or making more micro levels as a reward for completing the combo lines. And while the latter would make a lot of sense to me, doing so would run the risk of having them lose their novelty. So a part of me is glad they're as sparse as they are. When you finish with nap time, you're given more of the story of what happened in your past, the story that will eventually intersect with your present, Sukuru Tazaki style. style, if Subaru was the double-beheaded version of Tony Hawk and Eric Costin. If it feels like I'm throwing new story elements at you out of nowhere, then I'm giving you a pretty good idea of how it felt playing for me. While the story isn't exactly hard to follow, there's quite a few plot points that seem to rear their head once in an offhand sentence and then get called back to 2 hours later without making a smooth appearance. When Chapter 2 has a fight sequence with the White Man that ends up coming back as a plot point at the end of Chapter 3, that's a pretty clean recursion. In Chapter 2, the character has been established, positions of power, a little bit of their belief system, the relationships. None of these elements have the complexity of when the ancestry tree links backwards, but they're well preserved in the player's mind, not only through recency, but prominence within the story and the fact that they actually played the segment. Compare that to when Foe's father is established as a high-ranking police officer in Chapter 1 with this line of dialogue, which doesn't come back into the story until the ending, which tries to explain the entirety of the character's motivation. It does technically make sense if you're looking at the story as a whole, but as someone who's going through the game for the first time, it feels like arse pulls so hard you could claw out your kidney. Again, technically it makes sense, but it's not a good feeling to go through, and it was a feeling that cropped up a lot in my first playthrough. DJ Cyber is actually your friend and always has been. Vital and DJ Cyber know you're Felix but won't tell you why. DJ Cyber put you in the machine at the beginning to knock you out, which worked because... a lot of plot point whiplash that makes for a frustrating follow along. I wouldn't really even have gripes with the story or think anything of it if it didn't have some moments that genuinely made me have a little giggle. Had me muttering to myself, damn, he's kinda sick with it. And one of the standouts... all this for me? A mere little guy? There's enough fun in here that I wouldn't skip the cutscenes on a first playthrough. You can tell a lot of thought went into how the characters would interact and clash, which makes for an enjoyable read line by line. But unfortunately it never comes together in a cohesive whole. It makes for a coagulation of nice micro interactions, but the macro story never tastes quite right. A shame, but at least you can skip past most of it, which it feels like the plot does when the final boss comes out of nowhere, which I guess is as good a time as any to talk about the combat. I think this is the only portion of the game that I'd call an actual fumble. I'd question why it's even in the game if the answer wasn't glaring at me from the back of my mind. Jet Set Radio did it, so we're gonna get the police involved too. And this time we're gonna clap back. Well, I'm always happy to beat up on some sexual predators. No, sorry, something got stuck in my throat. I didn't find the Hive Mind's inclusion as a major gameplay element added all that much. In fact, it adds so little that you don't really feel their flaws in what they are, but what they aren't, which from this point forward is going to start becoming a bit of a theme. The forced combat sections show that there isn't a lot of meat on the fighting system's bones, which actually isn't that much of a problem. The humanoid enemies are dealt with swiftly so long as you figure out that jumping after a hit acts as a launcher, which lets you tag the cop and get rid of them quickly. The more mechanical enemies all have spots you need to trick onto in order to tag them. Between the two of them, the mechanical enemies are easily the most enjoyable to deal with since they kind of act as a different purpose to the movement mechanics, but neither of them are exactly great. As a pace breaker, the forced combat sections they're fine, or at least they are when they aren't starting off every sequence with 8 to 10 normal police officers that get boring to dispatch after the first one. The only fight I actively enjoyed was the one against the larger mechanized bipedal fellow, a reminder that this is the police by the way. What I liked about him is that even though they're an enemy with a classic 3-part glowing eye design, they're always vulnerable, so long as you can find a vantage point to get up to a weak spot and get your epic Mickey on. This lets you flex enemy knowledge to speed up the fight and also utilizes the environment in how you go about the scenario, letting the context of the space make each fight feel different while also engaging with the best of the game's systems. This enemy is great, but until that point, I hope you like Groundhog Day. Every single other enemy in every single encounter has a very distinct sameness to them, but even if there wasn't, we would still run into 2 other problems. I could just never put myself in that position, and even if I did, like, okay then. When you're handling the combat outside of the story, there's effectively zero risk or reason to engage with it. The enemies aren't intrusive enough to have any meaningful impact on what you're doing, so as you're skating around racking up a several million point combo trying to find any multipliers you might have forgotten, you're riding past all of this content that feels like it isn't working as intended. Not that I think it would be any better if they were more intrusive, since that would mean interacting with a dull and repetitive system, but whenever I skate past it, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like the game's begging for a little bit of my spare attention, and sorry mate, I only use debit card. Even this combo that I used to demonstrate didn't end when the police stepped in, it ended when I stepped on some stairs. Somebody go warn Banksy. Or better yet, go and surround Banksy with stairs, the pretentious fucking... If you want a game that combines combat with an extreme sports title, I'd recommend Rollerdrome. It's a game with its own problems, but it's designed around it. So unlike here, where it feels a little odd and stilted, there's an actual... like a video game. Thankfully, the game's final boss, which is an entirely unique fight, is actually okay. It takes some of the parts of the Gundam fight and hangs all its big, floppy weak points out for all to see. I wouldn't call it special, it's not going to go up there with Maiden Astraea, but it's at least a fairly non-linear boss that you feel like you're breaking in all the right ways. Taking out multiple weak spots in the same airtime and using the web of rails to act as a safety net is this rewarding trickle down. It's not treacherous, but it's still making me smile, which is like the point of all this, right? The fight might not have been great, but it felt like a nice wrap up to a main campaign that I enjoyed well enough. Maybe a part of that was the excitement to get to the end game. I was especially fingers crossed that there would be a hard mode. When the credits rolled though and I was sent back to the overworld without one, I wasn't too unhappy, but it did feel a bit limp. I enjoyed my time with the game enough so far that I felt compelled to 100% it. From this point though, the game starts to show so much more of its potential, but also how much of it doesn't fully capitalize on. Much like the game itself, I'm struggling to figure out where I want to focus. There's a lot of goals that the game wants to touch on, but it never finds that one thing that it does really well. It's kind of a platformer, kind of a collectathon, kind of an extreme sports game, yet at the same time it isn't exactly excellent at any of those elements. Since I was and kind of still am the fighting game guy, who's also the skating game guy, I guess I'll start with the extreme sports combos, where if you're insecure enough to care about the achievements, it's encouraged through that external reward, even if there's nothing in the game that pushes you for high scores. While the combo system is most closely adjacent to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, it's really its own thing. In any of the Tony Hawk titles, you're constantly walking a knife edge of smashing your face against the pavement and being called a virgin. Between the balance bar, player orientation, trying to trick just a little bit too late, there's quite a few ways you can eat shit, with Tony Hawk as a series zeroing in on this aspect of the game to make for a title that's exciting and complex. If you're also looking for that from Bomber or Cyberpunk, be prepared to be let down. Once I saw a skateboard and a multiplier, that was the experience I was expecting and still kinda do, which isn't cognitive bias, that's stupidity, that's the one. As a result, there might be some vested interest clouding my perception when I say I really don't think that BRC properly capitalizes on the systems that it's established here. It seems like this game wants to go for a more relaxed, or more appropriately, laid-back feel. The fact that the combo system has no fail state being the most standout example, IMO. The timer at the bottom of the screen on a manual is supposed to act as a forced dropout point, but it's so easy to work around and reset, it's hardly even a factor that will come into play. Without any bailing system or even a balance bar to keep on top of, it's extremely simple to keep a combo going forever. When that's not finding spots that let you easily cycle around the same two objects, it's sitting atop a pole that lets you go eat din-dins, or it's finding a spot like these.
Yo, you wanna learn how to do a fucking infinite?
This is all done with a purpose though. The game's attempting to open up how you traverse the space, to the point where the combo system has to make concessions. Like Tony Hawk, on top of your base score you also have a multiplier. However here, instead of the total amount of tricks forming the multiplier, it's environmental elements. Leaning into hard corners and wall riding gives you a bigger number to direct you to better personhood. And since you can't get a multiplier off of an object that has been previously used in the same combo, you're also directed out from your infinite little cubbyhole. I think this is great. The encouragement to move around the level and pay attention to the space creates a nice tracking game in your mind of where you've been, where you want to be soon, and what route around the level might be the most effective to get a large amount of multipliers in a small space of time without having to backtrack later. It's an excellent idea in concept, and even in parts of the execution. They nailed the feeling of leaning into a corner with the boost you're provided, so some of the best bits of the game are put in the spotlight both in terms of feel and systemic importance. The previously mentioned comboed being tied to meter gain always pushes you you towards thinking about effective lines, so even simple point A to point B traversal is more involved without needing to lean on danger. It's these excellent bits that were the smaller pieces to a larger whole that was driving my enjoyment of the campaign. But in the post-game, where the combos are more emphasized due to an absence of a mission structure or a set of leading goals, it morphs into something else. None of the positives are necessarily gone, but running the numbers leaves a lot to be desired. Take for example how the combo system pushes you outwards to explore the map. While it's still the case that you are encouraged to go and explore the space, you aren't forced to. That might sound good, but a byproduct of that is that if you're utilizing the entire system, you're extremely likely to run out of things to create a multiplier, at which point the lack of a fail state, or a forced endpoint, creates one of two branching paths. You either continue to explore the level and feel like you've run out of things to do as the act of keeping up a combo becomes monotonous, or you find a spot where you can comfortably light punch, medium punch, light kick, heavy punch. In the position where you've explored the majority of the level, which you are likely to do due to a lack of a fail state, you become the cow at the beginning of the illusion of choice. But as someone who isn't milkable, I could see that both roads led to a feeling of disappointment. Without the idea of risk, high scores become effectively meaningless once you've reached a point of systemic fluency. The beginning, middle, and end of a combo are all of the same difficulty and challenge, that being basically none. So there's nothing you're struggling against that signifies the value of your score. Even more so, that becomes a problem when combos actually end. There's no tension to having a high base or multiplier. There's nothing where you have to weigh up where you want to go or what you need to manage, so when the combo finally drops because you either forgot to hold the right trigger or got bored, your accumulated total score doesn't resonate a glorious sense of achievement, but a half-hearted flop, like receiving an A+ from a teacher whose only thoughts are with where their life went wrong. Again, nothing about the systems that are there are creating that problem, it's unfortunately a lack of a looming fail state or endpoint to provide you with a proper feeling of payoff. I want to point out that doesn't necessarily need to be a balance bar like in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. That is a game with its own goals, so even if that would please me and my School 2 deprived brain, I don't think that would be the right fit for a more laid back mechanic set that this game is going for. Still though, even if most of the problems here are created by the systems that aren't, that doesn't mean that the systems that are there are flawless. The fact that specials, or whatever they call the moves when you hold down and boost and do a trick at the same time, reset the extremely generous timer that's supposed to cause a combo to drop, completely circumvents any challenge when you're getting boost from comboing to begin with. Spraying down a wall provides you with points that contribute to your base, however it's such a minuscule amount of points that even the slight risk the police pose simply isn't worth considering. This further isolates the combo system from the rest of the game once you've finished the main campaign, continuing to emphasize how little is actually going on in the system. Manuals being tied to a trigger isn't intrinsically a bad thing, but the fact that the trigger only affects jump height on a rail means that you can effectively keep the trigger held down forever and combos will never drop. I'm going to agree with you now that these are nitpicks. I am being a pedantic little shit, I agree, but when the endgame's biggest draw for me was this element, the nits ballooned in my termite-infested brain and started screaming, "Don't you wish you were playing Tony Hawk right now?" The bigger number just isn't fun to chase beyond a certain point due to an extreme lack of risk, even if you have the police at their maximum density. Something I'd applaud if the emotion that it inspired within me was one of relaxation or zen, but even when I was going for high scores the first time around, it was only a limp boredom. I know this kind of sounds like I'm pushing the combos against the wall and pulling the trigger, but I do want to remind you, I still enjoyed it when it was a smaller part of a more explorative game with a mission structure to tie things together. To say it's a bad combo system would be to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but the bathwater is carrying cholera, and that could always be better. Thankfully, if you're going into Bomb Rush without the expectation to cyberfuck around with big numbers for 100-something hours, I think the post-game holds up a lot better, although it's still not flawless. As a collectathon, this game works in two parts: the taggable spots that work as a collection of outputs, and the collectible inputs that are sprays, songs, and cosmetics. These are two extremely simple aspects of the game, but by god if it's not the best part thanks to the hole-in-one that is the game's aesthetics. And I don't mean a hole-in-one like this, I mean a hole-in-one like this. I understand I'm a little late to this observation, 20-something minutes into this review, shit show, whatever you want to call it, but in case you're lacking a head with eyes and ears, I want to point out how drop-dead gorgeous this game is. I'm not nearly deeply steeped enough in the world of graffiti art to make any nuanced points here, for I am unfortunately a gamer, cursed to have the aesthetic taste of a toddler with cataracts, but the sheer variety of art styles on display here is exceptional. You can tell a lot of love went into every tag from both the artists at Team Reptile and the commissioned artists, and an equal amount of care went into the environments, characters, little cabinets, the music both created in-house and commissioned. It's a game full of love, and by fuck if you aren't gonna sit your ass down for at least 6 hours and go, God, this game's incredible to look at. It's gonna go on to inspire thousands of low-poly artists who are reaching their 1/3 life crisis. Some of them might even be good at it. Using that as leverage to create a world that you want to explore isn't exactly complicated, but damn if it isn't infinitely more rewarding to go and scour the world for some pretty PNGs than some FPXs that I'm never gonna use. Despite not knowing the first thing about graffiti, I was always a little excited to find a new piece to throw up on the wall, somehow always having them be cohesive within the game's aesthetic and a delight to look at, which is my cue to reiterate, fuck Banksy! All of that is to say that at no point kinda was I frustrated with the reward of the collectathon. All of my gripes come from the actual process involved, so depending on if you're drawn to the mechanics or aesthetics of the game will determine if what I'm about to say might or might not apply to your own opinion. One of which being what parts of this were fun and which parts weren't. I found going around the map and looking for every spot a treat when new locations were plentiful. You'd have a nice little roll around the level and just naturally stumble your way into a tag, or be beckoned into the big yellow tag me graphic from the distance, like a 16th century sailor to a siren song, or scurvy. When you don't have to be so intentional with searching for spots because you can see them, with your task being figuring out how to get to them, it's delightful. I especially like these two in Millennium Hill, which almost looks like you can get to them, but they're just out of reach. It kind of leaves you wondering how you get there, and then when you get up to the train tracks above and you inevitably forget about them, you have this dawning realization as you see them again in the distance that acts as a payoff before you've even hit the wall. That's not the only way though. You might figure out that you can stand atop the little grab boxes and use them as platforms to get up that way, or in this case, the leftmost spot, use this forbidden tech. I don't know if this is intentional or not. However, keep this flexibility in mind, because it's an unfortunate exception to the norm. A lot of levels, despite being quite open, are fairly limited in the way that you can actually traverse from point to point. In the initial playthrough, you'll hardly ever notice this. You've got enough shinies to chase after that you've always got something to look towards. But as that gets more and more sparse, it becomes a bit more of an issue. You end up flowing through areas in the exact same way, and without any challenge from the system mechanics to spice things up, you end up feeling like the Proclaimers just to get to your next spray. Take this circular high street section of Millennium Mall. The only way to get up to the second level is through this escalator or this ramp, and the only way to get up to the third floor is through this escalator or these fish. This produces an environment that is not only limited to 2 possible approaches, but is also limited to 2 directive flows, causing you to engage with the space the same way every time it's approached. It causes the space to become tiresome extremely quickly, on top of the outer ring design that separates everything in the mall, making every space long and drawn out. This area and Matan are my least favorite areas in the game for the reason of limited choice and repetitive traversal that I almost actively disliked 100%ing. Matan especially feels like an attempt at making a grandiose final level, but doing that through large horizontal catwalks that don't have much to connect them left me bored. The level design is what's holding back my enjoyment of the collectathon here. I'm still drawn to distant landmarks, but the process becomes a ball ache. Compare that to Pyramid Island, which is undeniably the best level in the game. A large vertical space that is a spectacle to tumble down that I look forward to every time. The winding rails from above create a spiderweb of microspaces all connected through gravity, so you're always a stone's throw away from the next fun thing to keep a combo going and connect you to where you want to be. This level, to me, is filled with the hints of level design that I think could have elevated this title to Gamer Kino. Take for example this section that connects you between the first layer and the second. The intended route is this long winding path around, that having some of its own fun inside of it, specifically this U-bend here that can be skipped over if you're feeling urgent. It's very cool, I like it. If you want to skip that though and you've got some heat, or with some boost, you can take this island over to the left and emerge into this open space from a completely different direction. Lastly, and maybe not so intentionally, you've got this forklift jump up. There's enough variety in this section of the level that it still feels fresh after 20 hours. It's that variety that's lacking from the rest of the game, and even parts of this level. If we look at it, 3 of the 4 approaches still come in from the same angle, which further runs the risk of the level getting stale before you finish finding everything inside of it. A risk that became a reality in both Matin and Millennium Mall. Beyond level design though, even in levels that I did enjoy, I still feel a vacancy waiting to be filled when I'd completed them. Outside of an achievement, there's no validation that you've tagged an entire level, with the exception of this number on the pause screen. This might seem like a toddler crying over not receiving Skittles once they've covered their fridge with garbage, and you are correct again, but that doesn't neglect the reality that I feel a lack of feedback for having put time in to find and complete every goal. I'm not saying this has to be anything major like a new skin or a spray, just anything to acknowledge the work that you've put in. In my head, the way that that would work is you take this number, that is the respect that you gain after a tag, and give it a slight golden sheen with little sparkles once it's maxed out. And somehow in this case go higher than maxed out. I don't know how I did this. I think a patch broke it. Unlike that vacancy, however, the input collection was a mix of really good and some of the most frustrating design decisions I've ever seen. Sprays, songs, and style are all out there somewhere in the world waiting to be found, with sprays specifically being plopped onto the map after most minor tasks in the story that helps to keep you plodding along. Some of these collectibles are great, like this track here and this spray here. These are excellent. They create a sense of curiosity about the space in a very similar way to the 2 sprays that I mentioned I really liked earlier, creating a point of interest, not being given an obvious route to it, and then having it play in the back of your mind as you figure out what routes might be viable towards it. It is setup, ambiguity, and payoff. One of the ways of making harder to find or more valuable collectibles create an emotion that is deemed as positive. Enjoyment is not derived necessarily from the thing that you gain, but how you gained it. That's not to say this is the only way that the game could make a collectible enjoyable to obtain. Take this Shogun spray for example. These glass panels are established to have something of value behind it, but when you break it down, you're given some cats. Nice to look at personally speaking, but not the kind of reward you're looking for. The only other thing is this garbage disposal unit, which normally only has boost canisters in it. However, without a reward in plain sight, it becomes the only other thing that you're drawn to, which reveals that this specific one contains a spray. This is rewarding your intuition and curiosity, but notice how even though you're being rewarded for a different thought pattern, it still contains the structure of setup, ambiguity, this time created through misdirection, and payoff. That positive emotion is still present, but it feels different. Lastly, you have surprise, simply obtaining something nice without any concept of setup that feels good because the thing you obtain is valuable. This isn't necessarily a bad way of creating positivity. When used sparingly, it creates a sense of wonder about the world and the space that you exist within. But if used too frequently, it can create a sense of frustration within the player as they're attempting to fully explore the space. It might not literally be random, but without a setup, the player will bang their head against the wall trying to find anything if this becomes the main method. I'm not going to say that this is the main way that Cyberfunk sets up a portion of its collectibles, but it is lent on far too frequently in my opinion. When that's not having to hug the walls to find an unmarked alleyway, or worse, slide through a hole you're never going to notice, that's literally hiding them in interactables with no indication that there's a reason to interact with this one specifically. This frustration for me created a void, the idea that this wasn't the focus of the game, but that was a feeling that I felt in every section of this game. The combo system is too forgiving to be a great extreme sports game. The main campaign is good, but needs the post-game to fill out the plate. The Collectathon could have been great, but isn't utilized in a way that goes beyond fine. The end result is a game that's good in a lot of ways, but has nothing that it's excellent at. Extra annoying considering all of these issues present themselves in the end game, which often overshadows my enjoyment of the initial playthrough. Maybe it's the best Jet Set Radio game? And quite frankly, if that was the goal, it's a shining achievement I even enjoyed this, considering I despise Jet Set Radio for everything beyond its aesthetic. I didn't really go into this wanting that though, and once I stopped looking for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, what I found was a lot of good ideas that were too attached to its influence to really flourish. That's why I had so much to say about a title where the gameplay loop can be experienced in about 9 seconds. I really did like the game that I played, but what feels like a fear to push the boat out means that it never puts itself in a position for me to love it. I guess that's fine. I'd imagine by the very surprising to me overwhelmingly positive score on Steam that this game has done well for its developers, which regardless of whether or not I feel let down by it means they're being rewarded for the blindingly clear passion that went into this project. And that is always a good thing for a team that very clearly deserves any success that is coming their way. If it was up to me though, I would bump that down to a positive. For all its flair and peaks at a more interesting game, it's let down by a katamari of smaller problems and systems that never reach their climax. It's a game I want to love, but unfortunately I just don't.